The Cry in the Woods, a scary story from Reddit. Subscribe to Scary Stories Vault for great videos to relax, study, or just enjoy. I never believed in ghosts. That's how these stories always start, don't they? Some skeptic who doesn't buy into anything supernatural suddenly finds themselves wrapped up in a world they can't explain, and it's too late by the time they realize what's happening. I'm not saying I believe in ghosts now. No, that would be too easy an explanation for what happened. What I experienced with my wife goes beyond that. This was something darker, something older, something far more terrifying. It started with the crying. Faint at first, almost imperceptible but persistent. We live in a house at the edge of a thick forest miles away from the nearest town. The trees around our home are ancient, towering above us with their twisted limbs, a constant reminder of how small we are in comparison to nature. My wife, Emily, loved it here. She always said the quiet calmed her, that the endless stretch of trees gave her a sense of peace, I liked it too, in my own way. I liked the solitude, the privacy, but that all changed when Emily started hearing the crying. It was late spring when she first mentioned it. We were sitting on the porch, enjoying the cool evening breeze, the sun dipping below the horizon. It had been a long day, and we were both unwinding with a drink, watching the fireflies flicker in the growing twilight. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked suddenly, her eyes narrowing as she looked toward the tree line. I paused, listening. The only sounds I could hear were the rustling of the leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. "Hear what?" I replied, confused. She frowned, tilting her head slightly. "It sounds like a baby crying." I listened again, more carefully this time, but still, I heard nothing. "Maybe it's a bird," I suggested. "Some of them can make noises that sound like crying." Emily shook her head. "No, this is different. It's faint, but it's definitely a baby. I've been hearing it for the past few nights, just around this time." That made me stop. "You've heard it before?" "Yeah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't say anything because I thought I was imagining it at first, but now I'm sure of it." I didn't want to dismiss her concerns outright, but I also didn't want her getting spooked over nothing. We were miles away from anyone, and the idea of a baby being out in the middle of the woods seemed impossible. "Maybe it's just an animal," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "There's no way a baby would be out there." But Emily wasn't convinced. Her eyes stayed fixed on the darkening woods, her expression growing more serious. "I think we should check it out." I felt a twinge of unease at her suggestion. The woods were dense, and it was easy to get lost even during the day. At night, it would be even more dangerous. Besides, I still wasn't sure there was anything to worry about. I don't think that's a good idea. It's getting dark, and we don't even know what we're hearing." But Emily was already standing up, grabbing a flashlight from the table by the door. "I'm going. If there's even the slightest chance that there's a baby out there, I'm not going to just sit here and do nothing." I stood up too, my stomach knotting with a mix of frustration and concern. "Emily, come on, we don't even know if it's a baby. It's probably just a coyote or something. Let's wait until morning, and if you still hear it, we can check it out then." But she wasn't listening. The determination in her eyes was clear, and I knew there was no convincing her otherwise. "I'll be careful," she said, her voice firm. "I just need to see for myself." I sighed, realizing that arguing would only make things worse. "Fine, but I'm coming with you." We grabbed our jackets and set off into the woods, the flashlight's beam cutting through the gathering darkness. The trees loomed over us, their branches creaking in the wind, casting long shadows on the forest floor. The deeper we went, the quieter it became, the sounds of the night fading into an eerie silence. We walked for what felt like hours, though it was probably only about 20 minutes. I was just about to suggest turning back when Emily stopped dead in her tracks. "There!" she whispered, pointing ahead. I strained my ears, and, for the first time, I heard it too. A faint, high-pitched wail carried on the wind. It was unmistakable. It sounded just like a baby crying, far off in the distance. My heart raced as a chill ran down my spine. It didn't make sense. There was no one around for miles, no reason for a baby to be out here, alone in the woods. And yet the sound was real. Emily looked at me, her expression a mixture of fear and resolve. "I told you," she said quietly. I nodded, feeling a growing sense of dread. "Let's be careful," I murmured. We pressed on, following the sound as it grew louder, more distinct. The trees seemed to close in around us, the air growing colder with each step. The flashlight flickered once, then twice before steadying again, but the sudden darkness in those brief moments made my skin crawl. The crying was closer now, so close that it seemed like we should be able to see something, a bundle, a form, anything, but there was nothing. Just trees, leaves, and the cold, empty air. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the crying stopped. We both froze, listening to the deafening silence that followed. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, the only sound in the stillness. "What happened?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. I don't know. Maybe whatever it was. But even as I said it, I knew it didn't feel right. The crying had stopped too abruptly, like someone had turned off a switch. It didn't fade. It didn't trail off. It just stopped. Emily took a step forward, shining the flashlight around the clearing we had entered. The beam swept across the ground, illuminating nothing but dirt and fallen leaves. There was no sign of a baby, no sign of a baby, no sign of anything. "I don't like this," I said, my voice tight with anxiety. "We should head back." But Emily wasn't ready to give up. She continued to scan the area, her face set in a determined frown. "Maybe we're close," she said. "Maybe we just missed it." "Or maybe there's nothing here," I replied, my nerves fraying. "Emily, please, let's go back." She hesitated for a moment, but then, to my relief, she nodded. "All right," she said softly. "Let's go." We turned to leave, but as we did, the crying started again, this time much louder, much closer. I felt a surge of panic as the sound pierced the night air. It wasn't just a faint wail anymore. It was full, urgent, desperate. Emily spun around, her eyes wide with alarm. "It's right here," she said, her voice shaking. But again, there was nothing. No baby, no movement, just the sound of crying filling the darkness around us. "I don't understand," Emily muttered, her voice cracking with fear and frustration. "Where is it?" "We need to leave," I said, my own fear boiling over. "Now." But before I could pull her away, the crying stopped again. This time, it didn't just stop. It was cut off, like someone had physically silenced it. The air grew cold, unnaturally cold, and the forest around us seemed to shift, the trees bending and groaning as if alive. Emily took a step back, her breath coming in short gasps. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper. "But we need to go, now." We turned and ran, the flashlight bobbing wildly as we sprinted back the way we had come. The trees seemed to close in around us, the path twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. My legs burned with the effort, but I didn't stop, didn't slow down. I could feel something behind us, something watching, something following. By the time we burst out of the tree line and into the clearing by our house, we were both gasping for breath, our hearts racing. I slammed the door shut behind us, locking it, as if that could somehow keep whatever was out there from following us in. For a long time, Neither of us spoke. We just stood there, breathing heavily, our minds racing to make sense of what had just happened. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "What was that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," I said, shaking my head. "I really don't know." For the next few days, we didn't talk about it. We went about our routine, but there was a tension in the air, a heaviness that neither of us could shake. Emily seemed quieter, more withdrawn, and I couldn't blame her. Whatever we had encountered in the woods that night, it wasn't natural. And then, a few nights later, it happened again. Emily woke me up in the middle of the night, shaking my arm urgently. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I groggily sat up, listening. At first, I didn't hear anything, but then, faintly, I caught it, the sound of a baby crying, drifting through the open window from the woods. My blood ran cold. For a moment, I lay there frozen, my heart thudding in my chest. It was the same sound, the same eerie, desperate wail we had heard that night in the woods. I wanted to believe it was all just in my head, some lingering fear or trauma from what had happened. But no, Emily had heard it too. It was real. "I told you," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "It's out there again." I threw off the covers, quickly shutting the window. The sound faded slightly, but it was still there, distant but insistent. I glanced at Emily. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. But there was something else in her expression, too. Skin-like resolve. "We have to go back," she said. "No," I said, more forcefully than I intended. "Absolutely not." "But the baby—" "There's no baby, Emily," I snapped, immediately regretting the sharpness in my voice. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "We don't know what it is, but it's not a baby. We have no idea what we're dealing with, and I'm not letting you go back out there." She stared at me, her lips pressed into a thin line. I could tell she didn't believe me. In her mind, the crying was real. It was a baby, and she was determined to find it. "We can't just ignore it," she said quietly. "What if it really is a child?" I closed my eyes, struggling to find the right words. "I know you want to help," I said softly. "But there's something wrong with this. You felt it too, didn't you? That night in the woods. It wasn't normal. That night in the woods. It wasn't normal. That crying, it's not. It's not right." She hesitated, her resolve wavering for a moment. But then the crying came again. Louder this time, and I saw her decision solidify in her eyes. "I can't just leave it," she whispered. "I have to try." Before I could stop her, she threw on her coat and grabbed the flashlight. Panic surged through me as I realized she was serious. She was going back into the woods, into whatever was out there. "Emily, wait." I ran after her as she headed for the door. "Please, don't do this." She turned to face me, her expression torn. "I can't explain it," she said, her voice breaking. "But I feel like it's calling to me. I don't know why, but I need to find out." I felt a lump in my throat, fear twisting in my gut. "Then I'm coming with you." She shook her head. "No, you're not. You'll try to stop me, and I need to do this." My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for her arm, desperate. "I can't let you go out there alone." Emily looked at me, her eyes softening. "I'll be fine. I just need to know." Before I could argue further, she slipped out the door, closing it softly behind her. For a moment, I stood there in shock, my mind racing. I wanted to run after her, to drag her back inside, but a part of me knew she wouldn't listen. Emily was stubborn. Once she made up her mind about something, there was no stopping her. But I couldn't just sit here either, not when something so strange, so wrong was happening. I grabbed my own coat, pulling it on quickly, and rushed after her. The night air was cold, biting at my skin as I stepped outside. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and I followed the faint path that Emily had taken into the woods. The crying was louder now, echoing through the trees. It didn't sound like any baby I had ever heard. It was too constant, too deliberate. It almost felt like the sound was guiding us deeper into the forest. I hurried through the undergrowth, my feet crunching on the fallen leaves, my heart racing. I called out her name, but the only response was the wind rustling through the trees and the eerie wail of the baby's cry. The woods grew darker as I ventured further in, the thick canopy of trees blotting out the moonlight. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move in the corners of my vision. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on me, as if the trees themselves were alive, watching. "Emily!" I shouted again, my voice cracking with desperation. "Emily, where are you?" The crying had grown louder, almost deafening now, but there was still no sign of her. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed deeper into the woods, the cold air burning in my lungs. And then, just ahead of me, I saw it, the faint beam of her flashlight bobbing through the trees. "Emily!" I called out, relief flooding through me. "Thank God! I found you!" But as I drew closer, I realized something was wrong. She was standing still, her back to me, the flashlight pointed at the ground. She wasn't moving, wasn't saying anything, just... I slowed my pace, my breath catching in my throat. "Emily?" She didn't respond. The crying had stopped. I approached cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the ground in front of her. That's when I saw what she was looking at. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a small bundle of cloth lying on the forest floor. It was wrapped tightly, as if someone had swaddled it. My heart leapt into my throat. Could it really be? But no. Something was wrong. The cloth wasn't moving. There was no sign of a baby, no sound, no movement. Just the cold, eerie silence of the woods. "Emily," I said quietly, stepping closer. "What?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, staring at the bundle. I reached out, gently touching her shoulder. "Emily?" Slowly, she turned to face me, and the look in her eyes sent a chill down my spine. She was pale, her face expressionless, her eyes wide and vacant, as if she were in some kind of trance. "Emily?" I whispered, panic rising in my chest. "What's going on?" Without a word, she knelt down beside the bundle, her hands trembling as she reached for it. I wanted to stop her, to pull her away, but something held me back. Something held me back. Something held me back. Something cold and primal that told me not to interfere. She carefully unwrapped the cloth, and as she did, I felt my stomach drop. There was no baby inside, just a pile of old, decayed leaves and dirt, cradled in the center of the swaddle like some kind of offering. My blood ran cold. "Emily, we need to go," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to leave." But she didn't move. She just stared at the pile of leaves, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Emily, please," I begged, pulling on her arm. "Something's wrong. We need to go." She finally looked up at me, her eyes glassy and distant. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "It's not a baby. It's never been a baby." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. She shook her head slowly, her gaze drifting back to the bundle of leaves. "I don't know, but it's old, older than us, older than the trees. It's been calling, and I had to come." I stared at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying, but none of it added up. "Emily, we need to go. Now." This time, she nodded, standing up slowly, her eyes never leaving the bundle on the ground. We turned and hurried back through the trees, the cold air biting at our skin. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened, but nothing made sense. The crying, the bundle of leaves, none of it made any logical sense. We reached the edge of the woods and burst out into the clearing by our house, slamming the door behind us. I locked it, my hands shaking, as if that flimsy lock could somehow protect us from whatever was out there. For a long time, we just stood there in silence, catching our breath, our minds reeling. Finally, Emily spoke. "It's not over," she said quietly. I turned to her, my heart sinking. "What do you mean?" She looked at me, her expression unreadable. "It's not going to stop. It called to me, and I answered. But now, it's not going to stop." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that we were safe now, but deep down, I knew she was right. Whatever we had encountered in those woods, whatever had been crying out, it wasn't finished with us, and it wasn't going to let us go. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, every creak of the house set my nerves on edge. I kept expecting to hear the crying again, but the woods were eerily silent, too silent. The days passed, but the feeling of dread never left. Emily became more withdrawn, spending hours staring out the window toward the woods. She hardly spoke, hardly ate. It was as if a part of her had been left behind in those trees. And then, one night, she disappeared. I woke up to find her side of the bed empty, the front door wide open. I ran outside, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. The woods loomed in the distance, dark and silent, but I knew that's where she had gone. I spent hours searching, calling her name, but she was gone. That was weeks ago. I've called the police, filed missing person reports, but no one has been able to find her. It's as if she vanished into thin air. But I know where she is. She's in the woods. She's with it. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I can still hear the faint sound of crying echoing through the trees.